In this lecture, I'd like to talk about economies of scope, where the per unit cost varies with the number of different items that are being produced by a firm. Remember that the law of diminishing returns states that as you try to expand output, your marginal productivity will eventually decline. Increasing marginal costs will eventually cause the average cost to increase as well, which of course can make it more difficult to compute break-even prices than it would be in a situation where the marginal cost was fixed. In that case, it's important when negotiating contracts to know what the cost curves look like. Otherwise, the firm will very likely end up negotiating contracts that are either unprofitable at worst or even at best suboptimal. If average costs fall with output, then economists refer to this as increasing returns to scale. In that case, it's in the firm's interest to focus on securing all of the strategies, or all of the sales rather, that enable them to pursue a strategy that leads to lower cost and increased levels of output. Or, as an alternative, if this is a firm that's a supplier to a store that has the potential to make some big orders, so find a way to capitalize again on those economies of scale and then try to share in the profit in the form of perhaps lower prices being offered to that big box store like Walmart or Home Depot. The benefit of selling, though, for Walmart or Home Depot is, of course, the supplier gets shelf space at all of the stores, the demand level increases dramatically, and that increase in demand enables them to walk down their cost curve and realize those lower marginal costs. So if your average costs are constant with respect to output, economists refer to this as a situation of constant returns to scale. Average costs rise with output. Economists describe this as decreasing returns to scale or diseconomies of scale. Learning curves lower the current production. Learning curves are characterized by a situation where future production actually costs less as a result of what is learned in the current production process. Let's consider the example of Gibson Guitars. Gibson Guitars produces guitar fingerboards, and they produce both a budget guitar made out of rosewood, which is kind of a low-end material, and then they also produce a high-end guitar which uses ebony. Now, there's a decreasing supply of ebony, and so that affects the production, affects the cost of ebony and therefore the cost of production of the high-end guitars. Brown streaks that show up naturally in ebony are seen by most consumers as a blemish in the high-end market, but actually are seen as a step up from rosewood. And so Gibson Guitars' strategy became one of focusing on capturing some economies of scope. And the way they did this was previously, when they had found some ebony or when they'd received ebony supplies with a lot of brown streaks, they'd simply discarded it because it wasn't of the suitable quality to be used in their high-end guitars. But they came to the realization that the streaked ebony would sell very well on the low-end budget guitars, in fact was viewed as a better product than the rosewood. So it had both a cost and a quality advantage. And so when we're dealing with situations like this, economies of scope, where we're dealing with production, in this case of two different products, the cost equals fixed plus marginal cost times quantity doesn't actually apply anymore. What they did do was they took that streaked or blemished ebony and started using that in their budget guitars, and that created both a cost and quality advantage. The cost of acquiring that ebony had already been factored into the price of the high-end guitars. They were accustomed to paying for and receiving a certain amount of blemished ebony. What this strategy allowed them to do then was use that blemished ebony at no additional cost beyond what they'd already been paying and manufacture or put that into the manufacture of budget guitars. So the cost formula on a standalone product basis really needs to be modified when we're dealing with economies of scope. If the cost of producing both of the products jointly is less than the cost of producing them on their own, as was the case for the two guitar types just described, then this describes a classic economies of scope between the two products. Tennessee Pride is a small family-owned company that makes, sells, and distributes a very popular breakfast sausage. Now, it cannot exploit the economies of scope associated with distributing a full line of consumer breakfast foods, such as a firm like, say, ConAgra might. The firm really has only two choices. One is that it could sell it out to a larger full-line company like ConAgra, and this company could exploit the scope economies associated with distribution, placing a higher value perhaps on the firm for Tennessee Pride than it would have on a standalone basis. Or it could outsource its distribution. Several regional and nationwide distribution companies actually distribute a variety of food products, Sysco being one that many are familiar with. And these companies could actually realize capture a certain economy of scope by distributing a full portfolio of meat products. And so there would be a potential partnership there that Tennessee Pride might also be able to capture. Another anecdote was a pet food company that was selling about 2,500 products or 2,500 different SKUs with 200 different formulas for each of those very refined, very specialized pet food items. They received a great deal of pressure from Walmart to actually reduce their prices. Now, in this case, they responded to Walmart by actually shrinking its product line. They shrunk it down to 70 SKUs with 13 different formulas. And this actually led to a cost saving for the company because it simply reduced their production costs. If we think about or look at the pet food production graph, in the old scenario, they had a lot of downtime where they were setting up their equipment and preparing it for each of those many, many different formulas. The new scenario, where they had far fewer SKUs and far fewer different formulas, enabled them to run their machinery and run their production equipment much larger percentage of the 24-hour day. So productions can also exhibit diseconomies of scope when the cost of producing two products together is higher than producing them separately. This was true of the pet food company. Producing so many different products in one factory was much more expensive than producing each food in a different factory because of the cleanup costs, the setup costs, the machinery cleanup costs, and the transition times associated with producing each of the different pet food formulas. Thanks for listening.